Mike Winder is passionate about two things: religion and politics. He grew up in Utah as a lifelong member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and has always been politically involved on the local level.
One of the secret sauces I've learned in my time in politics is that local is where it really matters.
Winder is currently serving his third term as a representative in the Utah legislature. He's also the author of 13 books, including Presidents and Prophets, the story of America's presidents and the LDS Church.
The church at the time felt enormous gratitude towards the Democratic Party. We've tried certainly since the mid-20th century to be more politically neutral.
I'm Rhett Nelson, and today Mike Winder discusses the book, his faith and political career, and the church's long and turbulent history with America's Commander-in-Chief. It's a privilege to talk to you. Like I say, I've been a fan of your book, Presidents and Prophets, for a long time, so it's good to have this chance.
Oh, you're kind.
So, well, first of all, before we get into our conversation, do you have any ties to Eastern Idaho at all?
My wife and my two sisters went to Ricks.
Oh, okay.
So there's that.
But that's it.
But that's it.
Before we get into your book, talk about your upbringing. You're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. How long have you been a member of that church?
I am lifetime member. My dad's side, our heritage goes back to Brigham Young and George Buchanan and John R. Winder and other early church leaders. On my mother's side, she was a convert in Seattle at the age of 3 is when her family joined the church, but I've been a lifelong member of that church.
Okay. Now, your last name, Winder, there was a prominent LDS leader named John Winder. Tell me who he was.
So he's my great-great-great-grandfather and kind of the patriarch of the family in America, joined the church in Liverpool and came over in 1853. And I was privileged to write his biography for my honors thesis as a history major in the honors program at the University of Utah.
Okay, very cool. So that was one of the first books you wrote. Is that right?
That was the first book I wrote, yeah.
The very first one.
And I remember my publisher, when we did that book, saying, well, you're going to write other books. I said, I am? He said, sure. Once you've done one, you've proven to yourself you can do it, and you'll do more. And he's right. I've now authored 13 books. But it's kind of like the marathon runner. Once they ran one, it's easier to do the next one.
Yeah, it gets in your blood, and you got to keep doing more.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so John Winder, tell me about, what were some of his accomplishments as an early leader in the church?
So he was fascinating because he's was quite, as a lot of them were back then, quite the business wrestler, involved with different things. He was involved with a tannery business. Of course, he brought over some Jersey cows to Utah and started what became Winder Dairy. He's the father of the Utah State Fair. Later, as a accomplished businessman, he was in the presiding bishopric. And in 1892, Wilford Woodruff appointed him to be in charge of overseeing the completion of the Salt Lake Temple and gave him 1 year to do it. And they had it ready by April 6, 1893 for the dedication. And so then he was in the temple presidency the rest of his life there. He was first counselor to Joseph F. Smith in the first presidency and was good to help hold down the fort while President Smith traveled to Hawaii and Europe and back east. And so he had a good accomplished career before he passed away in 1910.
Wow. And he was your great-great-grandfather, you said?
3 greats.
3 greats. Okay. So
my kids are the 6th generation Winders to live on what we call Winder Lane here in West Valley City by the old dairy farm. I've got 91-year-old grandma next door and different cousins and aunts and uncles up and down the lane.
Very cool. So, yeah, wow. So you come from a pretty strong Mormon heritage then. That's cool.
Yep. So
this next question might kind of coincide with what we just talked about, but, you're a lifelong member of the church. Was there one, I guess, when did you become have you always been so passionate about your faith?
I have. I've been kind of a lifelong true believer and, of course, was a seminary graduate, served a mission in Taiwan, and I guess it's part of my DNA is looking for ways to build the kingdom and improve the world around us.
Was there one particular experience that stands out when you became interested in, your heritage and that really solidified your faith for you?
Really at a very young age, I was quite intrigued with genealogy and family history and the scriptures. I learned to read by listening to books on tape of the Book of Mormon stories for beginning readers, or the Old Testament stories for beginning readers, and literally learned how to read as a 4-year-old from those scriptures. I remember at age 7 hearing the story of President Kimball challenging someone in a state conference to read the standard works, and so I started in Genesis and read the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price, starting at age 7 and finishing right before I was ordained a deacon at age 12. And so I've had a lifelong love of the scriptures, and that's stayed with me through the years as well.
Wow, that's unusual for a kid.
Yeah, we're all nerdy in our own ways.
Well, very cool. What point did becoming involved in politics and running for office become an interest for you?
I've been a lifelong church nerd, but political nerd too. In fact, my mom would point out a journal entry from when I was 6 or 7 where I said, when I grow up, I want to be the prophet and the president. And of course, as an adult, I'm happy to just be a legislator and, the ward temple and family history leader right now. And so obviously, when you're a little boy, you want to fly to the moon and Mount Everest and everything in between. But I have had a lifelong interest in politics. And I was the state teenage Republican chair in high school. I was the student body president in high school. Was involved with college Republicans and was an intern for a congressman in college. And so the idea of looking at public service as a way to give back and make the community a better place has been in my blood for my whole life, really. And
you mentioned earlier you've served as mayor and the city council for West Valley City, and now you're a representative.
Correct.
And in the total of your political career, is there one piece of legislation or one policy that you've helped author that you're most proud of?
Well, I love the placemaking aspect of things. I love in West Valley City, we're a suburb of Salt Lake that's kind of grown up around farm fields, and we never had a true downtown. So to help launch the remodel of Valley Fair Mall and bringing out light rail and the Fairborn Station development, that was a big deal when I was mayor, and I was excited to be part of that. My day job today is I'm assistant city manager and economic development director for the city of Mill Creek. So I still have this love of local government, and now I'm trying to help Utah's newest incorporated city build a city center. And so that's been a satisfaction of mine, is kind of placemaking and helping to build city centers. Another one you could say is the Jordan River. The Jordan River, for those in Idaho listening, runs right through the Salt Lake Valley. It runs from a freshwater lake, Utah Lake, down to a salty Dead Sea, the Great Salt Lake, and so the pioneers named it the Jordan River after its counterpart in the Old World. And you have West Valley City is right on the Jordan River, and when I was mayor of West Valley, I helped organize and get together a suspension bridge that we called Pioneer Crossing Bridge that went over the river, and a historic marker that was my son Michael's Eagle Scout project to designate where the pioneers first came over Jordan to the west side of the valley. It's kind of the place monument, if you will, for the whole west side of the valley. So that was an exciting time. As a legislator, I've been able to create the Jordan River Recreation Area and secure some ongoing funding to help improve and build trails along the river. The Tracy Aviary now has a campus along the river, and we're looking at doing more bridges and loops so that some of the homeless camps and illegal activities going on along the river are going away as we bring more positive activity there along the river. And that river touches not only West Valley City, where I have a lot of my career, but also it touches Mill Creek, where I currently work in my day job. And so to improve that strip of wilderness in the middle of an urban valley has been an exciting thing too.
Based on what I've learned about you, and you said this yourself just a few minutes ago, you're passionate about making a difference on the local level and getting involved politically on the local level. For you is something that is kind of your motivation. Do you have any? Well, I guess do you feel like there's do you think voters are involved enough in their local politics? First of all,
they're not, and it actually I think has become worse in the internet age. And let me explain. When I first started on the city council and was on the West Valley city staff, we would have 4 newspapers show up to every council meeting. You'd have the West Valley News that was mailed out, that was distributed each week. You had the West Valley Journal that was mailed out once a month. You had the Salt Lake Tribune and the Deseret News. Well, as time went on, they thinned out their local coverage because it's easier, both certainly in the online world, to cover national news and statewide news and have a larger reach and audience than it is to spend a lot of effort on an article that's only read by a city or a town. And it's sad. You look back in the 1980s and newspapers were covering planning commission meetings, and you had big, thick daily newspapers with tons of local news coverage. Now it's very scant. And because of that, it skewed everyone's perspective that they think what's going on with Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez affects their life in a big way, and it does in some ways, but a bigger impact is really what's going on at your state, county, and city level. And one of the secret sauces I've learned in my time in politics is that local is where it really matters and where it really counts. When I was a small boy, I had ambitions, like I say, of running for Congress or different things. Now, as I'm older and I like to think wiser, I'm realizing no way. The lever of impact is really at the local level.
So that being said, are you planning on, when is your 3rd term up as representative?
Well, state reps were up every 2 years, and we have redistricting this year with the census, and I anticipate running for the legislature again next year. Do I jump to the Senate or stay in the House is something I'm kind of looking at, but I love local government. I have no interest in going onto the federal level, for example. I remember the late Senator Bob Bennett once told me, Mike, Congress is only good at doing 2 things, nothing and overreacting. And he's exactly right. You look at what happened after 9/11, and what did we get? The Patriot Act and the 20-year war in Afghanistan. You look at what happened after the financial crisis, and you got the overreach of Dodd-Frank and the banking regulations that are smothering small community banks around the country. You look at what happened with the pandemic, and they're throwing trillions and trillions of dollars in the aftermath. And so at the federal level, they are good at nothing and overreacting. And at the local level, we're good at problem solving. We're good at fostering an environment to encourage job creation and supporting families and education and placemaking and improving roads and infrastructure. And so I'm a firm believer in the Constitution of the United States and the system of federalism set up. And I think there's too much federal overreach, candidly, because the local level, we can get our arms around the problems and solve them. And at the national level, we do one size fits all that really doesn't work very well and ends up being very, very expensive.
Well, so that being said then, any interest perhaps in running for like Governor of Utah or something on the state level?
You know, I have a good friend, Spencer Cox, who's our brand new governor of Utah, doing a fantastic job. My older sister, Amy Winder Newton, she's a Salt Lake County councilwoman, actually ran unsuccessfully for governor last year. I don't think that's the card for me either. I love city government. Like I say, my day job now is at Mill Creek. I have a lot of great legacy at West Valley City, and city government and even legislative has been a fun sweet spot for me. And so no ambition or plans to run for governor or Congress at this point. There may have been at one point in my career, but like I say, I'm older and wiser now.
Well, so let's shift gears then now. Let's talk about your book. It's called Presidents and Prophets, and it's the story of America's presidents and their interactions with the LDS Church. This book you published in 2007, if I remember right. So it's 13 years old. It's over a decade old now. But is there a story about what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, that was a fun book. It was a regional bestseller, and I still, even this month, had someone write me and said, "Hey, I just bought 12 copies for each of my family. Can you autograph them?" And so that book still has a great impact on people. I grew up as a nerdy kid reading encyclopedias, and I kind of like the idea of categorization and easy access information. And you hear stories about Joseph Smith and Martin Van Buren, or Ronald Reagan visiting Utah and touring Welfare Square with President Benson. And when I was working on my John R. Winder book, I came across the incident when Teddy Roosevelt came and spoke in the Tabernacle, and what a big deal that was. And so this whole idea of, I love American history, I love church history, and realizing that they don't happen in silos, but they actually intersected quite a bit, was pretty fascinating to me. So when I started Presidents and Prophets, I thought, okay, I'm going to treat this almost encyclopedic, where chapter 1 is George Washington, chapter 2 is John Adams, and on you go. And so it started with a basic Word document, where I opened a Word document for each of the 40 some odd presidents we had at the time, and scoured the indexes of all the books on my bookshelf for any presidents. And when I found little nuggets, I put them in. Well, once I exhausted that, I went to the local Granger Seminary and went through their bookshelf and our stake library. And then I went down to the church history library, and of course online. And by the end, I'm corresponding with presidential libraries, and I had a library card at the Library of Congress and was back in D.C. researching, reading John Quincy Adams and James K. Polk's journals on microfilm there in the in the Library of Congress. And at the end was a fascinating collection of each U.S. president and their interaction with the church, and all of them had some interactions. It was really a lot of fun.
At the very beginning of the book, I love how you introduce this, because you talk about meeting President George W. Bush during a worship service at the church that's right across the street from the White House one Sunday.
Right.
Do you want to tell that story for people?
Sure. So I was actually back in D.C. as a city councilman at the time. I was there in a League of Cities conference, and I actually had been doing a little bit of research on my Presidents and Prophets book that same weekend while I was back there. Well, Sunday rolled around, and the conference wasn't starting until that afternoon, and so I said to the councilman traveling with me, Steve Vincent, hey, we ought to go to church somewhere, and just for fun, let's go to St. John's Episcopal Church by the White House. Every president since James Madison has worshipped there, and that'd be kind of a cool thing to do. And so he agreed, and we took the metro over, and as we went to walk in that early morning service, the Secret Service were outside with their magnetometers, patting people down and doing their thing. And I thought, that's interesting. That's not normal. This could be our lucky day. And we get in, and first of all, what a gorgeous building that is. Beautiful stained glass windows, and a historic building. One of the back pews has a plaque on it that says, here's where Abraham Lincoln came to pray for our divided nation during the depths of the Civil War. But anyway, we go in, and I look, and about halfway up the chapel is President George W. Bush and his wife, Laura Bush. And I have a little bit of an outgoing personality, so I walked down, and there's a lady on the end of the row there, and I said, excuse me, are these seats taken? She said no, and so we go in and sit down right next to Laura Bush. And it is kind of an exciting thing. They have a thing in those Episcopal churches called the giving of the peace, where the pastor invites you to stand and shake hands with your neighbor, and you say, peace of the Lord to you. And there's two big Secret Service guys on the bench behind us, of course. And I thought, I wonder if they'll budge. So I said, peace of the Lord to you, and peace of the Lord to you, sir. And then Laura Bush, in her sweet Texas drawl, extended her hand and said, peace of the Lord to you. And then just sitting down, the President of the United States caught my eye and reached across his wife and clasped my hand and looked me squarely in the eye and said, peace of the Lord to you. And it was a cool thing. It was Easter time, so we'd stand and sing Christ the Lord is risen today together. We'd recite the Lord's Prayer. When it was time to pray, we would kneel on, they had these prayer cushions there. And being the Church of the Presidents, I was on Woodrow Wilson's prayer cushion, and my friend Steve was on Calvin Coolidge's. I looked over, Laura Bush was kneeling on Ronald Reagan's prayer cushion, and George W. Bush, not surprisingly, was using his dad's. So that was kind of a cool thing. Well, it came time for communion, and they started going up row by row for the wine and the wafer there. And I look at Steve and I said, yikes, what do we do here? And we said, well, it's kind of their sacrament, and I don't need any alcohol today. Let's stay put. So we stayed put. But when the first family came back, they looked at us like, why didn't you guys go up? And so I pulled out my West Valley City Council business card and felt some explanation was needed. So I wrote on the back of it, President and Mrs. Bush, even as Mormons from Utah are pray for you and are honored to worship together, Mike. And I gently set down my card between me and Laura Bush. I didn't want to be tackled by the Secret Service. She picked it up and read it and smiled and nudged her hubby, and he pulled out from his pocket his reading glasses and put them on and read it and really studied it and looked at me and nodded and smiled, and then he pulled out a black Sharpie and wrote, "Thanks, Mike, and God bless George Bush," and handed me back my card. And of course, I've kept that card, and that's been a fun souvenir. At the end of that meeting, they were ushered out we were asked to stay put while they ushered out the back door, and then we were allowed out the front. But I wrote in my journal that night, I said, there we were, two Mormon city council members, a Methodist first lady, a born-again Christian president, in an Episcopal church worshiping God together. And isn't America great? And it is great, Rhett. And to be able, that was one of those tender mercies from, I was just finishing writing Presidents and Prophets. I'd literally been doing research the day before in the Library of Congress, and then to actually go to church with a president and share a faith moment with him was really a tender mercy that I couldn't have orchestrated myself if I tried.
Yeah, no kidding. And that's cool that you have this. You have the souvenir. You have the card to show it. From your political career, have you since met any other presidents since George W. Bush?
Well, it's kind of a funny thing. I have a buddy, Mike Maurer, who said, "Hey, if you like going to church with presidents, you need to go to Georgia. Jimmy Carter teaches a Sunday school class." And so I was with my dad, and we decided to do a guys trip one weekend and went to Georgia and saw some Civil War sites and different things there in the Atlanta area. But we went down to Plains, Georgia, population 635, to the Maranatha Baptist Church, where Jimmy Carter teaches Sunday school. And we're able to sit on the front row of Jimmy Carter's Sunday school class and answer questions and participate in the lesson and pose for pictures after outside. And that was a wonderful experience. And he's a good man of faith. There was another time where President Bill Clinton was coming through Salt Lake, and I was able to slip out of my church meetings on a Sunday afternoon and go up to the University of Utah and hear him speak. And as he was working the rope line afterwards, gave him a copy of Presidents and Prophets, and was able to, and he said, "Hey, thanks for this. I tried to help the Mormons out whenever I could." And I had a buddy doing advance work who said Bill Clinton backstage afterwards was saying, "Look at this. This is impressive." And he seemed to really like it. Another time when I was mayor of West Valley City, I was invited to the White House for a conference and mayor's meeting where President Obama spoke to us and Vice President Biden, and I was able to, ask a question of the president and get some selfies after as they worked the room, and so that was fun. I haven't met Donald Trump, although I've heard him speak a couple times in Salt Lake City and as a delegate to the Republican National Convention. I did not meet George Herbert Walker Bush, but I saw him in person several times, and I was up close there. So yeah, it's been fun to rub shoulders and meet some different presidents.
When you have rubbed shoulders with some of these men who have been president, do you ever wonder if their positive words about the Mormons, about members of the LDS Church, if it's genuine or if it's just them being political to win over voters?
That's a fair question, and you wonder sometimes because when I was working on Presidents and Prophets, there's a lot of fascinating anecdotes with David O. McKay, the church president, and Lyndon B. Johnson, for example. And at first I was a little skeptical, thinking Johnson was the consummate politician, and is this just, him saying the nice things? But he seemed very genuine in developing the friendship with President McKay. And Ronald Reagan, I interviewed for the book a number of advisors that were close to him and that would have, yes, he said nice things when he was on stage with church leaders, but what did he say behind the scenes? And what was his interest in the church? And that seemed very genuine. Or one of my favorite anecdotes I came across in researching that book was Warren G. Harding. he had a friendship with Senator Reed Smoot from Utah, who was also an LDS apostle at the time. And one night, late at night, Reed Smoot gets a phone call. He says, "Reed, this is President Harding down at the White House, and the First Lady is quite ill. And the doctors have attended to her, and I'm not sure what else to do. Could you come down and give her one of your priesthood blessings of healing that you've talked to me about before?" And
Wow.
Reed Smoot went down and into the White House, up to the residence, and gave the First Lady a blessing of healing, and she got better. Well, a president doesn't call a senator in the middle of the night and saying, "Hey, come, my wife's in her pajamas and it's the middle of the night, come on down to the White House," just for political reasons.
That's true.
There has to be some sincerity there. And so I think a lot of times a smart politician is going to say nice things to the crowd. But I feel even with Bill Clinton and others, there's a genuine respect for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the good that they do in the world.
So let's talk about some of these presidents. You still with me?
Yeah.
I heard a weird buzz
Yeah,
there.
it's just a text.
So I think it's important to note for people who were listening that the United States history and LDS Church history have a little bit of different timelines. So obviously, U.S. history begins before the establishment of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which wasn't established until 1830.
Right.
So that being said, some of the early presidents never really had the opportunity to know what the LDS Church was. So, but just with that in mind, which president was most sympathetic to the Mormons?
Yeah, and by the way, just to address your timeline issue, so the first chapters of my book, George Washington, for example, didn't know what a Mormon was in his lifetime because it didn't exist yet. So I do talk a bit about his religious views, but also about what the church's view of him has been in hindsight.
Right.
And, doing his baptismal work vicariously in the Mississippi River in Nauvoo, for example, and some of those sorts of things. There was a great quote in there so Teddy Roosevelt became quite impressed with the Mormons. He didn't drink or smoke and was impressed that the saints had their word of wisdom. He loved big families and was impressed with what the saints did there. He loved the West and what they were able to do to make the desert blossom as the rose. And when he passed away, there was a letter between Heber J. Grant and Reed Smoot where he said, "I think that Roosevelt felt that we were right." And Smoot agreed and said he was, nearer to the church than any man who ever occupied the presidential chair. And that was up to that point. Talking to other observers, Ronald Reagan was the one that was closest to the church in modern times. And he got to know the saints in California, where there's a lot of Latter-day Saints, and he had some LDS advisors. And in the White House, he had a lot who were very close to him, who were Latter-day Saints. He came out to Utah multiple times, had great rapport with Jake Garn and Orrin Hatch, our senators, and would talk about the church and talk about the welfare program, and had been given a copy of the Book of Mormon on multiple occasions. And even there's a great story when Jake Garn, Senator Garn of Utah, was at the White House and mentioned his son that was leaving on a mission to England. And Ronald Reagan said, "Do you think it'd be okay if I wrote him a letter?" And Garn said, "Man, he would love that." So the President of the United States scribbles out a letter to Jake Garn's son, who was in the MTC at the time, and even quoted a scripture from the Book of Alma in it that he must have pulled off the shelf and read. And so imagine being in the MTC and you get a letter from the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, wishing you well on your mission. So there's some fun things that have happened.
Yeah, and that's great. And he actually had a copy of the Book of Mormon as well.
Yes.
Yeah, that's cool. Going back to just some of those early church presidents, I think it was, and you touch on this a little bit in your book, I think it was Ezra Taft Benson, when he was president of the LDS Church, gave a talk about the founding fathers and, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all those men, and talked about a vision that one of the early church presidents had of them appearing to him in one of the temples.
Right, Wilford Woodruff.
Yeah. And how
And
they...
Wilford Woodruff had had a vision when he was president of the St. George Temple, and it was Washington and the other founders coming to him saying, "Hey, we've worked hard to set up this republic for the church to blossom, and we're waiting for our work to be completed." And of course, Wilford Woodruff went the next day with the brethren there in the temple at St. George and did their work for him. It's interesting, in some cases, like George Washington, his baptismal work had been done already before, but maybe the rest of his work hadn't been done. One little anecdote there too is in Latter-day Saint temples, not only are we baptized vicariously for those who have passed on, but there's other ordinances they receive as well, including sealing to their spouse, so that they can be man and wife for not just this life, but for eternity. They're also the men are also ordained to an office in the priesthood vicariously, because we believe that that they're kind of priests in their own home forever, sort of thing. And in the case of the presidents of the United States, when they were going through being ordained elders in the priesthood, when it got to George Washington, Wilford Woodruff said, "No, for Washington he shall be made a high priest," which, as Latter-day Saints know, is the higher office in the priesthood, not just an elder, but a high priest. So there in St. George, all the past presidents were ordained elders, and George Washington got the honor of being a high priest, which is kind of another fun thing.
Yeah. Let's talk about, because we're based in eastern Idaho. I was just reading this morning, Theodore Roosevelt made a visit to Rexburg.
He did.
During his presidency. Was he the first president to visit eastern Idaho?
I don't know for sure, but he must have. I mean, eastern Idaho wasn't on a lot of itineraries there.
Of course. In fact, Idaho wasn't a state until 1890, so...
Right. So someone had passed through the territory. What helped Utah candidly was the Transcontinental Railroad. That got President Grant and some of the others there sooner than probably Idaho saw them. But Teddy Roosevelt loved that area, and of course he loved Yellowstone and the Tetons, and was there in eastern Idaho as well. There's a good rail spur from Salt Lake up to Idaho Falls, and so he would have had a chance to see the people there and that beautiful country there.
Which president signed Utah into statehood?
Grover Cleveland did, which is kind of an interesting thing, because you have all these Republican presidents from Lincoln on for a half century, with the exception of Grover Cleveland, who was our 22nd president, and then lost, and then came back again as our 24th president.
Right. And
it was interesting because the church at the time felt enormous gratitude towards the Democratic Party, because one, that was the president who signed statehood, and two, you remember the Republican Party was formed in the 1850s to, quote, abolish the twin relics of barbarism, slavery, and polygamy. Uh-huh. And so many of the early Latter-day Saints were Democrats, and as Utah tried to gain statehood, they said, okay, we really need more of a balance, and the brethren would often go into congregations and say, we'd like this half of the congregation to be Democrat and this half to be Republican. Try to balance things out a bit. And still this day, there's families in Utah that are one or the other because of that divided statehood.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you mentioned, the creation of the Republican Party and the church's support of the Democratic Party in the past, because today the church is politically neutral, but I get a sense from reading this book that, in the early history, I got a sense that the church was very politically involved and even endorsed certain people for president.
Right. You got where different prophets would endorse presidents, and we've tried certainly since the mid-20th century to be more politically neutral. That served the church's purposes better, and I know from talking to many that the church really appreciates having friends in both Republican and Democratic administrations. I remember, Bill Clinton made the comment if he tried to help with some missionary work where there's some visa issues in South America, for example. And so it's been very helpful for the church to have friends in court on both sides, regardless of who's in power.
As you have researched presidents in writing this book, and I'm not talking just with their relationships with the LDS Church, but just in general, who do you feel is the most underrated president in U.S. history?
James K. Polk.
How so? Why?
Here's a guy who ran for president. He was kind of a dark horse. People didn't think he'd get in. And he did, and he said, I'm running for president for these 4 reasons. And, a lot of them were, we want to bring Texas into the Union. We want to expand to Oregon. We want, he had kind of his little list of reasons. He got in office. He did everything he said he was going to do. And then when it came time to run for election, he said, well, why should I? I did everything I said I was going to do. And he didn't run for re-election. And you think, wow, how refreshing to have a president who says, hey, here's what I'm going to do. They get in and they do it. So, I don't know. I wouldn't say he's my favorite president, but he's certainly underrated. You don't hear James K. Polk trotted out there a lot, but our nation wouldn't be what it is today without the expansion of what he did in his time. He helped the Saints with the Mormon Battalion, which helped finance our way west. So I'm looking at through the Mormon lens, certainly President Polk was helpful too. So there's an example of someone that people don't think about, but really made a big difference in America today.
And give us, and refresh our memories, what years did he serve as president?
Oh, now you're testing me. Well, he was when the Saints were crossing the plains, the 1840s. You have, let's see, James K. Polk, 1845 to 1849.
So 1 term. I've found it interesting as I was reading the book that a lot of those early presidents, we had a lot of 1-term presidents, and even several that served for like a year or even less than that. In fact, from Andrew Jackson to Ulysses S. Grant, there was 40 years where we didn't have a president who served more than 1 term.
Right. It was a very tumultuous time leading up to the Civil War, of course, and in recent years, most presidents are 2-term presidents unless fluky things happen. In the case of President Trump, I'm sure he would have been a 2-term president if COVID hadn't hit, for example. In the case of George Herbert Walker Bush, he would have been a 2-term president if Ross Perot hadn't run, for example.
Yeah.
Siphoned away votes. Jimmy Carter was a time of high inflation and Iran hostages, and he was in over his head with some challenges there. But generally, presidents are elected to 2 terms nowadays, unless there's something strange going on.
Yeah. I just thought that was interesting how we had a lot of, short-lived presidents.
Well, you have William Henry Harrison, who gave the longest inaugural speech in history without a coat on a cold winter rainy day and died of pneumonia a month later. He's our shortest term president.
And then we had, was it John Tyler?
Yeah, and John Tyler, because Harrison died, John Tyler became the first vice president to assume the presidency. And there's a lot of question on, does the vice president automatically become president, or are they just acting president until them? So it's actually John Tyler, to his credit, that set the precedent of, no, I'm the president. And, of course, his detractors called him his accidency because he was just there because the president died.
And by the way, just kind of as a side note, just a fun fact, there was a news report a couple years ago from the USA Today that reported that John Tyler's grandson
was still alive.
And he,
I saw that. That's a mind bender, isn't it?
That is, because now that's just 2 generations from one of the earliest presidents in U.S. history to now.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that the American presidency that America is not that old of a country.
Right.
And one thing I would challenge your listeners to do is one of the joys of Presidents and Prophets was for people to say, okay, here's American history on the one hand, and we're meshing it with church history that we're familiar with. But if you want to do something even more fun than that on a personal level, try to mesh American history with your family history. And I would start by finding the oldest member of your family and saying, Grandma or great-grandma or whoever, tell me what presidents you remember. I've done this with my grandma, and did it once with a great-grandma, where you ask them, what's the earliest president you remember, and what do you remember about each of the presidents? And those are fascinating little accounts that even 100 years from now, your descendants will get a kick out of reading.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, my grandma was a big supporter of FDR. She lived
Right.
during that time, and she can go on and on about FDR and how he helped this country, you know?
Right. And so it is fun to see what they lived through and what they thought of different presidents.
Right. Well, so you talked about the most underrated president. From doing this project, do you now have a favorite U.S. president?
Well, on a personal level, I'm a big Theodore Roosevelt fan. In fact, I was published in the Journal of the Theodore Roosevelt Association on my paper of Roosevelt and the Mormons, and it's his zest and zeal for life and for America and for doing the right things and doing good and building up things that is very inspiring. Bully, as he would say, and so Teddy Roosevelt's my favorite. But there's certainly some other good men, and I hope someday we see some women as president of the United States as well.
Since the publication of this book, we've had 3 additional presidents. Do you want to talk briefly about President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden's connections to the Mormons?
Sure. President Obama had, they all made visits to Utah. They've all met with church leaders, toured Welfare Square. A common thing lately is we'll go back and give them a copy of their genealogy. That happened in the Obama years with I think Ben Elder Oaks went back, and that also happened in the Trump time. The Republican administrations lately have tended to have more more LDS advisors, and that was true with President Trump with Rob Porter and some others. And so there's been some ties that way. President Trump's his opinion of the Mormons is colored a bit because of his back and forth with Mitt Romney, candidly, and that's been interesting to observe.
Right. I get the impression that, because you said Republicans historically lately have had the most LDS advisors, I get the feeling that President Obama wasn't very sympathetic to the Mormons, and I'm basing that off of a news report about someone had inadvertently baptized one of his ancestors.
Right.
And then the church since undid that. They reversed
yes,
that.
And I would guess that America's first black president bristles a bit at some of the history that the Church of Jesus Christ has had with race relations as well. But President Obama was always fair with LDS leaders that worked with him. And you talked to Harry Reid, who is the most prominent Democrat in Congress at the time, who worked closely with President Obama, and they were always cordial and civil. And I've talked with friends here in Utah when President Obama's visited in their homes for fundraisers or whatnot, and he was always, he's very pragmatic, and so he was very positive towards the church when there was reason to, and didn't seem to have a problem really. He appreciated the faith-based efforts that helped as well. President Biden has a long history with a lot of LDS senators, most notable Orrin Hatch and also Harry Reid, and so I think that's helped shape his view of things. Kamala Harris, his vice president, was out here in Utah at this place State Park, and I talked with Scott Howell, the local former state senator that took her around, and she's impressed with what the saints have been able to do here in the West. And so, I think it is good for the church to have positive relationships on both sides of the aisle. And one of the things I tried really hard in Presidents and Prophets is to not be a partisan hack with that book.
Right.
We see that too often in media today, whether it's cable news or talk radio. And yes, I'm a Republican, but I'm an American first, and I didn't want to make that book to be about slandering this party or that. And so I've had a number of positive comments from people who've read Presidents and Prophets saying it was well balanced and it was fair to presidents on both sides of the aisle.
With the addition of 3 new presidents, are you planning any update to this book to include, the additional president's relationship to the LDS Church?
I'm actually pitching my publisher right now on doing a Presidents and Prophets family edition. It would be a slightly different version of this book, but it would also be an opportunity to update the three presidents that have come into office since Presidents and Prophets first came out. So we'll see where that project evolves. The book industry is ever changing in this media landscape, but it's a great project, and it'd be fun to dust it off and take it to the next level.
It's interesting how history is sort of, Mitt Romney ran for president in 2012, and that sort of brought this idea of Mormons and presidents front and center in America. Do you think that there will ever be a Mormon elected president?
Of course there will be. Now, is that in the next decade or 2 decades or your lifetime or mine? I don't know, but eventually there will be. And I would hope it would be in this century. There's great leaders. Latter-day Saints tend to breed good leaders, and part of that is, from the time you're in primary, you learn public speaking, whether it's giving a family home evening lesson or a talk in primary. And so we groom good public speakers. We groom good civic-minded people that try to make a difference in their community. When you look at everything from Mitt Romney to Harry Reid to the head of the Republican National Committee right now, LDS, you get a lot of prominent Latter-day Saints that we tend to punch above our weight on the national scene that way, and so I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see a Latter-day Saint president this century.
As far as you're pitching your publisher right now about an update to Presidents and Prophets. Your latest book is called Favorite Scriptures of 100 American Leaders. Any other additional book projects in the works for you?
I've been a little busy with some work projects lately, and had some fun puttering on family history. So I don't have a new book in the hopper. This Presidents and Prophets Family Edition would be the one I'd be chewing on if I'm chewing on any. So, but once you do 13 books and you're 45 years old, that doesn't mean there's not another book or two up your sleeve or that'll come down the road.
Right. Well, Mike, you've been generous with your time. It's certainly been a pleasure to talk to you. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap this up?
No, you've touched on some of my favorite stories and some of my favorite anecdotes, and I appreciate that. The East Idaho News is a great outlet there to take a different look. Like I say, local news is so important, and regional news and things that are of interest, not just the one-size-fits-all national thing. So I appreciate the good work you're doing there in East Idaho, and wish you and all your readers and listeners well.